I think it will become obvious in retrospect that we are primarily a cooperative species. We don't actually manage time in our lives. We actually manage energy. Because the energy needs to be expressed, it needs to be used. You're always trying to find this way to channel energy. And if you don't find a channel for it, the cup overflows. It has to find somewhere to go. And you find a new invention overlapping really strongly with the kind of thoughts and most forward-thinking ideas of visionaries and polymaths through history. That to me it's as much of a discovery of how things already really work as it is coming up with a great new idea.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the World Game Podcast, where I unpack the work of architect and polymath Buckminster Fuller. Today, I'm joined by Beau Turner, CEO of Abundant Minds, to explore Bitcoin mining as an energy technology. So, Beau, if Bucky were alive, he would be ecstatic to see the work you are doing. Before we dive into that, your experience in engineering, real estate, and Bitcoin mining make you the perfect fit for this conversation. So I was hoping, can you tell us a bit about yourself by walking us through your journey in those three different domains?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having me on, Mac. I'm really excited to do this. I got a quick taste of what you wanted to cover today, and I'm not joking when I say this is the most excited I've been to talk about any range of topics. I feel like it'll be really fun. But just to give people a little bit of my background, I went to Southern Methodist University. I got a degree in engineering management and information systems. I was exposed to Bitcoin back in 2015, but I don't feel like I really kind of got the bug and really started diving deeper into how the technology works until about 2020. And then very quickly thereafter, got really deep down the mining rabbit hole, which is kind of the gate that opened that sort of made the world very interesting to me from an engineering perspective. So right after school, I started a real estate company, kind of didn't pay much attention to engineering, didn't pay much attention to Bitcoin. And then after a few years of that, after doing some developments, some creative financing, really just went full bore into Bitcoin. 2020 changed a lot of things for me personally and for the world at large. And one of those was having to re-examine the assumptions that we make about how the world works, what carries value, and what a truly perfect and thermodynamic system looks like for both money, energy, and just the evolution of technology. So that led me into the Bitcoin mining space. It was at first just my exploration into finding passive income that's actually passive and really works out well. I had a couple of mishaps in working with partners that didn't make it passive for me and didn't make it income for me, to be quite frank with you. And so I started the company. I started Abundant Minds and built the service that I'd wished I had as an investor. And initially, it was really just this ideal form of income that I was searching for. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into in the sense of looking much more deeply into energy, into the infrastructure that runs our world, and really inheriting this beautiful mission of creating or really revealing the abundance that exists in our world through this very misunderstood and often mischaracterized industry called Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, that's great. I think you'll be a perfect sparring partner for this. I tended to be a bit of like a brainstorming session. There's a lot of complicated topics and esoteric niches we can dive into. I think your background's super unique. It'll allow us to go back and forth a bit, but really excited to have you here. I actually want to start with real estate briefly, because I think it's a good gateway into some of this. Bucky predicted that by our generation, people would be storing their wealth in digital property. And he understood that physical property gave people a false sense of security in many ways. And you told me that you came to a similar realization at one point and divested all of your real estate portfolio. Can you walk us through your logic in coming to that conclusion? Because I found it really interesting.
Yeah, so God, there's so many ways that we could go with this, and I'll stick with just talking about real estate for this question. We've got these analogies that we use for Bitcoin, and they're all ways of expressing how we store value. And it was really eye-opening for me. Probably the first analogy that we all get with Bitcoin is talking about it as digital gold. Many people have heard Saylor's analogy of digital property. Fewer have heard his analogy of digital energy. And then if we have a chance to get to it, I love Knut Svanholm's exposition of Bitcoin as kind of element zero, where it's this non-physical binding of energy that actually puts a new element on the periodic table. So anyway, going back to real estate, I saw real estate as the most stable and predictable store of long-term value that I could see carrying wealth far into the future. It's a hard asset. It produces income in most cases. Everybody has a intuitive sense for why it carries value, why it's got use. And if there's a case to be made for storing your wealth in gold, I would say that real estate is kind of the evolution of gold, but with a use case. It's reasonably scarce, produces cash flow. And that was my reason for treating it that way. I had parents and grandparents who strongly believed in gold as a store of value and as real money. And as time went on and as they saw kind of the paper markets manipulate that as a store of value, they tended to move more toward real estate. And I inherited that viewpoint. And what changed for me was, especially around 2020, when we had a huge expansion in the money supply, it became much more clear to me that real estate was essentially mostly backed by debt. So there's a huge sea of assets in the world, and a majority of that sea of assets is made up by real estate and debt, each about 300 and 400 trillion out of a total basket of about 900 trillion in assets. At least that was as of 2020. And so the big shift for me was realizing that even if I was responsible and didn't take on excessive leverage with my property, that my investment, the value of my investment, could be impacted by the leverage that other people took on their properties. So if you think about the events of 2008, many people were underwater on making payments for a loan that was of a higher value than the property itself, because the value that the property created, people couldn't make their payments. And then suddenly that creates a cascading effect where even the people who own their properties free and clear experience a huge devaluation in nominal terms of what they own. I saw it as even though it felt secure and felt like a very known quantity, I've seen different estimates, but somewhere on the order of 80% of the value of real estate is the debt that backs it. So as long as that was the case, I felt like as sure-footed as I felt was not a true map to reality. So in a very just physics-based sense, the energy stored in that property was mostly hot air and was mostly credit that was created out of thin air. So that, while I was looking for something safe to carry me far into the future, really made me feel unsettled about the next 40 years of holding real estate as your primary investment. And I'm definitely someone who is focused, who's quite obsessive when they latch onto something. So I viewed real estate as my one vehicle to build and sustain wealth. And when that confidence was shaken, I started looking for my next number one.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because I think that's what you initially told me. It was the counterparty risk of even feeling like you own something outright and still being at risk, or coming to that realization, that I found really interesting, because it touches on Bucky's point of this false sense of security. So another thing he's talked about is this new accounting system tied to money and energy that would eventually deflate property value and free people from real estate. I kind of feel like that's what's happening. I mean, you've taken that step, and it won't happen overnight, but over a long enough period of time, I can't help but think that that's the trend. As an architect and dealing with buildings, debt, property development, is that the vision you kind of have as well? Is that the realization you're coming to?
Yeah, I think the biggest eye-opener is real estate's useful, right? There's a reason that it's valuable, but it is only valuable, or it should only be valuable, to the point of its utility. So what's happened since, I would say, the 70s is that the value of real estate has slowly, and then recently much more quickly, disconnected from its actual utility value, and has really inherited this huge amount of value from monetary premium. So people are going into real estate just to outrun the loss of value of the currency, rather than actually getting a piece of real estate because it's highly able to be utilized by them. You see people building Airbnb portfolios and rental properties in places that they don't even really want property and get no marginal use out of it, but it's the best place that they feel that they can store value. And so to me, it's just a case of a good idea that's been broken by a system of incentives that unfortunately has disconnected real value from the underlying asset itself.
Yeah, and we're starting to feel those second, third order side effects of that, I feel like. That's a great way to sort of kick this off. Another reason I wanted to talk to you today was because we had this passing conversation where we both agreed that the energy benefits of Bitcoin network were not some accidental side effect. But I think we both felt that Satoshi understood what he was doing. And a lot of my conviction for this comes from studying the work of Buckminster Fuller. It's really given me a interesting perspective where I've had to rethink a lot of my thinking. And I wanted to ask you, what leads you to the belief that this is the case as someone who's fully immersed in this?
One of the things that really, I'm always looking for the connection that's kind of at a higher order. So not just the logical chain of events and sequence of outcomes that come from adopting a certain technology, but the kind of overstory that gets told through history. And Bucky is one of these examples. One of the early, series of quotes that came into my world was from, I think it was from Jason Lowery's book, where, Nikola Tesla and Henry Ford, hundreds of years, I guess over 100 years ago, before we had software, before we had computing technology, before we had any of the underpinnings of a system like Bitcoin, talked about energy money. They talked about an energy-backed currency. They talked about energy-based accounting systems, a battle between intelligent machines that would stop wars. And so what's really interesting to me is, as much as this is an invention, it's like Satoshi invented Bitcoin, he also discovered something that was kind of already in the collective consciousness, that was at least thought of or kind of designed in a much more loose way far before his time. And that signals to me not just a good idea, but something that's really close to the fundamental base layer of reality. When you find a new invention overlapping really strongly with the kind of thoughts and most forward-thinking ideas of visionaries and polymaths through history, that to me it's as much of a discovery of how things already really work as it is coming up with a great new idea. So whenever I see those breadcrumbs that are kind of left through time, that's much more of a signal to me that we're on the right path. And it's only backed up by, of course, a really well-designed system and technology. I'm just really encouraged when I see really great minds through history coming up with the kind of framework that eventually gets born into the universe through this amazing software protocol that we all use now.
Yeah. I think about it as triangulating my information. And so when there's people who have been talking about this before the internet, before any of that, to me, that's a perspective that helps me really feel like there's definitely something here that's underlying, deeply rooted, like you said, into the nature of reality. And so in some ways, I think having these perspectives from a long time ago help us triangulate this information and find these patterns that are more just people talking their bags. They didn't have their bags back then. And so I find that a really refreshing take. And part of what makes people like Ford, Bucky, Tesla, and others who have talked about this really unique. And there's actually really interesting connection between Bucky and Ford that we probably won't get into today, but they did work pretty closely together. And there's evidence that they've talked about some of these ideas. But before we get too far into that, I took a fresh look at your bio, and you mentioned wealth empowering individuals. Bucky often cited energy, specifically energy as a per unit measure of time, as a better measure for wealth than money or fiat currencies. Can you help explain, because this is so core to your business and mission, why energy security is so important for people?
Anything that we talk about today, like any single rabbit hole, we could probably go on for quite a few hours about. The overarching thing, and this was not something that I came up with, and I really discovered it relatively recently in my life, is how crucial energy is to the affordability of life for everybody here on Earth. So I didn't appreciate this really until I got into the mining space, and energy was the chief optimization variable that you're always looking to optimize your energy procurement cost. And as I looked deeper into it, I realized that, it's very close to the surface for miners how important energy stability, energy price, and availability is. But for every member of civilization on this earth, energy is an input to the finished goods that you use, whether it's the chair that you're sitting in, the computer that we're using right now, the food that we eat, all of the logistics that go to us getting resources. A huge baked in portion of the cost of us existing here on Earth is the energy that it takes to make and transport the things that we use. And so if you can have an upstream impact on energy systems, you actually are able to impact everybody's life at some level. And so that to me was, again, it wasn't like the surface level first thing that I was exposed to when I first got into the mining space. It only became more obvious as I got deeper how important it is to not just have energy security, but to have energy abundance and to have energy that's affordable. And if we can have that kind of impact where we actually make energy more affordable for people, you've got the chance to make life, just the cost of living for people cheaper. You've got the chance for people to take new risks and create new ideas that previously were not available to be explored because energy is a constraint. There's all kinds of reasons why you would want energy to be abundant. And I think that it's kind of like the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere in China, and then across the world in America, you've got a tornado forming. If we can be the butterfly flap and change the energy dynamics, specifically of a region, in our case, the Pacific Northwest region, then we've got a shot at changing the lives of millions of people with that one choice to optimize energy.
Yeah, that's super interesting. These second or third order effects Bucky often talked about. He even, in some ways, he would suggest that the coin is just the pretext for energy abundance, rather than energy abundance being an accidental side effect of the monetary system. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, which one came first and which one's really enforcing the other.
If you think about like the Kardashev scale, where civilizations are ranked by how well they channel energy, specifically of their star or group of stars near them, you're essentially ranking a civilization by their effectiveness in channeling and making available the potential energy that's around them. And I think it's a good measure because, as I already mentioned, it's the input for every kind of innovation and wealth that we use in this world. And it makes total sense to classify a civilization not just by how good its money is, but how effective it is at channeling energy, and that leads to essentially everything else. It's the input variable that has the most impact on the entire equation.
Yeah, and tie it back to Ford and others' vision, they often, or Bucky talked about, this is the key to stopping the cyclical trap of violence. He believed once resources were abundant, not only abundant, but others understood and saw that resources were abundant, in particular energy and our ability to harness energy, then we wouldn't have as many things to fight over, if anything. And so it was an interesting way to get us to come to the realization that, hey, if we have abundant resources, we don't have to fight over our limited resources anymore.
It goes really against the wiring of human beings to be violent with each other. It's really profoundly not in alignment with just how we're wired to exist in the world. I think it will become obvious in retrospect that we are primarily a cooperative species, and that if we are able to solve some of these core system design problems of how the world operates, that there's really no need for it. And as much as healthy competition is a good thing, I think cooperation and collaboration are really where humanity shines. And when we unlock that, it's just like approaching the singularity. It's a gradually and then suddenly kind of thing. You see a lot, just an absolute Cambrian explosion of innovation, of the ability of people to channel resources and enjoy the process, thrive as a society, and people really enjoy existing.
Spoken like a systems engineer. That brings me to a next point I wanted to talk about on your bio. So you also bring up or mention protection from oppression and power. I did a terrible job explaining this with my last guest, but I want to try it again with you because I think it makes more sense in the context of mining. Historically, there are these examples of successful, peaceful revolutions that resist oppression. But whether you're resisting oppression or physical force or entropy, Bucky would say that while admirable, passive resistance will not amplify the production of life support. And so, to me, this is a big differentiator between Bitcoin and something like gold or other forms of passive resistance. As you know, Bitcoin, on the other hand, is a form of, in many ways, active resistance. So it's almost like a martial art or like regenerative braking in an EV, where I feel like the act of resisting in turn is amplifying what Bucky would call life support or hash rate or energy production or energy infrastructure. Do you agree with that? I feel like from your perspective, you probably see that on one end holding Bitcoin, on the other end amplifying what Bucky would call life support, which is essentially the build out of energy infrastructure.
Yeah, I've never said this out loud, so I'll try to piece it together in a way that makes sense. Energy is always looking to go from a high potential energy state to a lower potential energy state, right? The universe is moving toward randomness, and energy is being lost to systems all the time. And you can see that as well. I mean, it's a little bit correlated to the warfare conversation, where we have this energy, we have this need to act, and it's expressed through this kind of unskilled method of physical warfare. Because the energy needs to be expressed, it needs to be used. You're always trying to find this way to channel energy. And if you don't find a channel for it, the cup overflows. It has to find somewhere to go. And so the question is not how do we stop using energy, but how do we channel it more effectively? You don't just stop warfare and instill a state of peace because that's the natural state. You find a direction that is more toward peace to channel the energy for. And so a roundabout way of saying, back to Jason Lowery's book, Software, we're not stopping the whole idea of competition and protection of resources and protection of private property through force. We're just moving to a higher order of expression of that force, where you're not shedding blood and blowing up towns. You're projecting energy in a skilled way to produce order that actually protects property in a nonviolent way. That, to me, is the evolution that we're looking at, is not how do we stop using energy, but how do we channel it more effectively in this higher order way that still protects property, that still enforces a cost to come and try to take something from somebody, but is organized in this very different way. And I find it so, the deeper that you study reality, I feel like it's just kind of reconciliation of paradoxes. The idea that we would get this very high order form of money by literally having computers around the world that produce disorder, like they're literally just guessing random numbers, is, to me, the peak of irony, but just beautiful system design. You're literally harnessing randomness and entropy, guessing into a void to create the most well-ordered financial and power projection system that we've ever created.
Yeah, it's God. For not having said that, you put it together really beautifully. It's something it's kind of hard to talk about, but it is interesting, isn't it? Again, going back to monetary technology versus energy technology, I think there are things like that when you view this network as a monetary technology, you could argue are maybe flawed. Things like privacy, the 51% attack. I feel like those things seem like you could make the argument for them being flaws in the system. But then when you think about this as an energy technology, to me, it's like perfection. All those things that as a monetary technology, you could argue maybe are not perfect, although it is also perfect money. When you view it as an energy technology, I feel like just all those things, you can tell it was engineered to perfection. To me, it's just a helpful perspective to have, not that one's right or the other, but it, in general, I feel like it gets more attention, at least in the mainstream, as a monetary technology.
Most people, and this goes to just educating around this, most people don't have the base and understanding that you can approach this kind of topic without being just way outside of their worldview, way outside of any kind of mental model that they've already developed. What I love about things like Bitcoin and other things that are just beautifully designed is you can approach it at almost any level. I mentioned earlier, digital gold is where most of us start. Okay, that's one way to understand it. Then you get digital property, Manhattan in cyberspace, as Saylor would say. And that's a whole other level of understanding that unlocks a different way of seeing this technology that's far beyond digital gold. But if you don't have the background in first understanding that level one, it's going to be really tough for you. Then you've got digital energy, where you're talking about carting actual energy resources across time and space to then be teleported or transported into another area where that energy can be used. And if you don't have those first two levels, that's really tough. And at that point, you got to get well into proof of work and energy storage and this kind of idea of it as a battery. And then, a level even deeper, which if you don't have the context for it to build that model beforehand of creating new element, because there's this non-physical item that binds energy to it, is if you don't have these different levels to stack on top of, it's unapproachable. And it honestly makes you sound insane. And it's probably why most of the great thinkers of history and of our time today are highly misunderstood and mischaracterized, is because before you can really intelligently argue with someone's point, you have to understand it. And most people do not take the time or the effort to understand what they're trying to contradict. And so I'm sure there's levels far beyond what I've explored. And I've spent quite a lot of time on this. And I've got all of my personal energy and net worth invested in seeing the space succeed. So you think that I've dove pretty deep down the rabbit hole, but there's levels. It's like math. Math just carries through every dimension. It is this language of expressing and communicating reality and seeing deeper into it. And it works at every single dimension. There's no 12th dimension where suddenly basic math doesn't work. It's just a higher order expression of this underlying structure of reality. And I think really beautifully and dare I say perfectly engineered technologies like Bitcoin are a reflection of that multiple levels of understanding that you can always keep going further and further. And just like when you're going into higher order math and you're talking about the seventh dimension and what a physical object in the seventh dimension looks like, it gets really, really tough to understand if you're not super confident in dimensions 1 through 3. It's hard enough to introduce time to the concept of a three-dimensional object. Just imagine, we're going way beyond the capacities of Neanderthal brain when we start talking about the implications, second, third, fourth, and fifth order effects of things like this that really have broad-reaching impacts across finance, across energy, across property, how we cooperate with each other, how we engage in even competition with each other. It's what makes this such an interesting thing to study, is that at every level, there's something new to uncover.
Yeah, I was hoping to go really deep with you because it's just fascinating. But I know you tend to put out a lot of great educational content, but you're usually focused on getting people through that first step, I feel like. So I haven't had the opportunity to pick your brain on some of these deeper concepts. So it's super interesting. I think Bucky understood this as well. And he said one encounter with something is not enough. It takes literally 3, 4, 5 times for it to slap you in the face, for you to really feel it and understand it and for things to click. And so part of what excites me is, the more as you peel back this onion, there's just more and more there. It's never ending, which makes your job really hard. You are currently working very closely with two things that are largely misunderstood, both money and energy. Can you share some of the misconceptions you see on your end?
There's so many. The easiest one that I end up talking about most is this idea that energy is scarce. Since we've already gone well down the rabbit hole, I don't even have to talk about, the physical energy that's available, like the wasted resources, the solar that gets curtailed every year in places like California, the methane that's stored at landfills that gets just exhausted into the air. Same with oil wells and natural gas vents. We're wasting a ton of potential energy. In a very just physics-based sense, there's a infinite amount of potential energy sitting in the plasma around us right now that's just not accessible because we don't know how to harness it. And so the idea that something like mining uses too much energy is, to me, one of those things that only becomes obvious that you're misunderstanding it when you've studied energy a little bit more deeply and realize how much there is available, and that the problem we have is not that there's not enough, but that we don't utilize what we have in the right way. And that goes back to even the idea of abundance is, there's this sense of not enoughness in the world. And it's not based on physical fact. It's based on resource allocation. It's based on perspective. It's based on how people approach the world. In reality, there's infinite opportunity all around us, and we're all in some sense limited by the way that we look at the world around us. Within a 5 square mile radius of where I sit right now, everybody that I probably ever need to connect with to get everything that I want in life exists, and they're separated only by this thin veneer of not being aware of who they are or how close exactly what you want is to you. And so that's kind of the metaphysical way I would talk about energy, is that it's really available to us, and we, unfortunately, most of the time introduce a lot of waste to our systems and don't use our resources effectively. In the money sense, there's so many misunderstandings. I don't think most people understand how money works at all. And that, to me, is the chief job that we have as educators in the Bitcoin space, is as much as it is to teach about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin works, to highlight why something like Bitcoin is so different than what already exists. And I use the example of a mirror. Like, I didn't know how badly organized or how unfair the existing financial system was until I had something to compare it to. And that's why something in part like Bitcoin is so powerful, is that truth really shines a light on the lies that exist all around it. And until you've got that beacon of truth shining a light, everything's just in the dark and you're grappling around just trying to navigate without really a reference point that shows you what's going on. So I would just say the more that I've studied Bitcoin, the more highlighted all of the issues in the existing financial system have become. And that's sometimes all we need is just, humans, we need analogies, we need comparisons, we need some kind of reference point. And if we don't have something to compare what already exists, then it's very tough for us to imagine an improvement to it.
Those are such good points. If you notice, there are more and more CPAs, accountants, even people in the banking industry that are coming forward and saying, hey, I've been in this business for a long time and I had no idea what money is, which the initial reaction is like, gosh, you deal with this every day. How could you not understand? But I think it's a fair thing to come to the realization to. These are like invisible things that are hard to wrap your head around. And frankly, people don't spend much time talking about. Bucky would say, to your point, we don't have an energy problem. We have a problem of ignorance. And, I'd like to come to the defense of some people because I think we misunderstand energy. And so much like accountants don't understand money, I think architects talk about energy all the time: net zero energy, geothermal energy, energy efficiency. And yet no one understands what energy is. And I myself, probably 10 years ago, came to the realization that if I want to be an architect in the 21st century, I need to understand what energy is. And we would talk about it, but I didn't understand what it was. And I could tell no one around me understood it either. And so I just want to come to the defense of people like these are things you don't spend much time thinking about. And even people like myself who live it, we don't really think about it too deeply. And it's frankly deeply rooted in the education system. As an architect, you're kind of taught energy use is bad. And that conflates a lot of things. There's a lot of nuance, right? You're conflating energy with fossil fuels and consumption and generation, but it's kind of deeply rooted in the education. And so to a certain extent, you have to unlearn everything you've learned. Bucky said the same thing in his 30s. He was like, nothing is adding up here. And I have to forget everything I've ever learned and start from scratch. And so he kind of took it to the extreme. And it's pretty well documented that he spent about 2 years in complete silence, which is really extreme, unlearning everything and just kind of starting back from first principles, studying people like Einstein and Henry Ford's work and other people's work, and just built his way back up. And then things, I think, started to add up and click. So it's a process, but it's hard to blame anyone,
Yeah, I get a lot of comfort in the idea that everybody has a set of incentives that they're operating by. And so it's not even necessarily that there's this, like a secret coup that's going on, that like it's being hidden from these people. It's like there's no incentive for a stockbroker to learn about what money is because their job is to sell stocks. There's no incentive for a utility operator to learn about energy fundamentals because all they're doing is supplying retail electricity that they probably didn't even generate. Your cashier doesn't understand the grocery store supply chain because they don't have to. There's no real incentive for them to do that unless they want to look deeper into the system and find another place within that system that they're trying to operate. And this was a huge surprise for me. Again, I'm only a couple years into really diving into energy, so I didn't understand how most of this worked for most of my life until my incentives were to figure it out and to see if I could solve the problem better than other people. And I was just absolutely shocked when I was first getting into mining and talking to these utilities and asking for these large blocks of power, how little they understood about energy procurement dynamics. And I guess the big shocker for me was, why don't these people understand the water that they're swimming in every day? They're swimming in energy procurement and they're delivering it to people all over the place. Why do they not care more about finding the cheapest, optimizing it? And the answer is their incentives aren't really to optimize it. It's just to make sure that people get their power. And until they complain, just make sure that the costs of operating the utility are covered, and you're not really thinking about making it cheaper or finding these intelligent ways that you can optimize the procurement of it, the usage of it, all these things that miners do to shave off that extra penny. For most people, there's no real incentive. If you've only got a $100 electric bill every month, the extra couple bucks is not going to make or break you. If you have a $1 million electric bill every month, extra, 10, 50, 100K, that can be the difference between you being in business or out of business. And so I just look at the incentives that people have to actually look deeply and study these things. And in most cases, they don't exist. So the incentives are really there for the entrepreneurs, the people who are looking to build something better and compete. And in the utility industry specifically, it's not very competitive. It might as well be a government function, essentially, for how entrenched, how slow moving, and heavily regulated it is. It's not a very entrepreneurial space in most cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. People have to come to it on their own terms in some ways, right? You have to hit that fork in the road and come to it on your own terms. And Bucky would refer to this as emergence by emergency. He tried to talk about a lot of this stuff, and it would fall on deaf ears. And eventually he realized people won't listen unless they're interested in to come to their own realization. So he had this beautiful design philosophy of not really telling people what to do or preaching, but he would come up with these inventions, so to speak, in his own world, in his own space, and he would just put them out into the world and walk away, knowing that when people interacted with these things, they would come to some sort of realization on their own terms. And he knew that that's what it would take for these ideas to click. And I can't help but see that's also exactly what Satoshi did. He didn't go out and tell people, hey, we're going to change money or we're going to change energy. He just designed this thing, put it out into the world, and walked away. And it shows a level of confidence in understanding that the rest would take care of itself. It might take a little bit of time. There might be a lag, but eventually people would hit that wall that you're talking about. And as soon as it started to provide them with enough friction, they'd start to find the answers. But until you hit the problem, there's no need to start looking for an answer. And it's interesting to see how that seems to be happening one by one. It gives me goosebumps thinking about it.
You've heard probably necessity is the mother of invention over and over throughout your life. And it's the case that many good ideas, many very impressive engineering feats get designed and never implemented because there is no need at that time. I mean, I imagine if Bitcoin had come out 20 years sooner and we didn't have the benefit of the backdrop of the great financial crisis as a clear impetus that something like this was needed, would it have been successful? There were other attempts at a similar design to Bitcoin, not exactly, but it wasn't created in a vacuum. There were other ideas, other implementations that were tried, didn't quite succeed, that didn't quite catch on. And a lot of that was just, it wasn't the right timing. It wasn't the right time of need where it was so obvious that this could catch fire and really gain the momentum for it to be what we're all expecting it to be at this point. There's no incentive for people to study something deeply if they don't have a problem to solve. And a coach of mine says, we're all looking for just-in-time information, not just-in-case information. Even if it's useful, even if it's very interesting, we're all really just looking to solve a problem that we have here and now. And it's part of why I think Bitcoin was such a rapidly adopted and obviously needed technology for countries that didn't have stable financial systems, and why America was kind of behind the curve. And it's because although we have high inflation, we don't have triple digit inflation every year. We don't have, governments that are getting toppled every few years. And so here it was largely a nice to have. And there's no real necessity for people to study a technology like this. Whereas if you're having your currency devalued double digits overnight or triple digits overnight, you're very interested in a technology like this. And it's much more present for you because it solves a real life problem that you have today. And so that's unfortunately the spur for most of the incredible innovation and forward progress that we have is some kind of crisis that needs to be solved, not 10 years from now, right now, today. And that's just reality, unfortunately, but it also creates a lot of progress.
Yeah. Let's use that as a catalyst to kind of jump back to your work a little bit. To some, energy consumption has this negative connotation that we talked about. Bucky would say, we don't have an energy problem. We have a problem of ignorance. He understood that we cannot have enough generation without consumption. And that's a unique property of the network. And to quote him directly, you can't have mass production without mass distribution. You can't have mass distribution without mass consumption. And you can't have mass consumption without mass buying capability. And so can you explain a little bit about the Bitcoin network's insatiable appetite for energy or buying capability.
Yeah. So this is maybe the coolest way that Bitcoin affects our energy systems, in my opinion, is that it really fits at every level of the energy delivery problem. So what do I mean by that? Consumption. The Bitcoin network wants to consume as much energy as you can throw at it 24/7, irregardless of when, what time of day, what the price is, doesn't matter. The Bitcoin network is always operating and is a perfect competition looking for more energy all the time. There's no other industry in the world that's like that. Distribution is interesting because distribution is one of the biggest problems that we face in the energy landscape today. As we've talked about, there's plenty of energy around the world. There's plenty of raw electrons or potential energy in materials that could be converted to energy. And the issue that we have is transmission capacity. There isn't the ability to move that energy everywhere that it needs to go. And so we essentially have a clogged system where the people that are already generating electricity can get it on the grid. The people who are trying to generate electricity have nowhere to send it. So their projects don't get funded. So what Bitcoin is doing, what Bitcoin mining is doing that is so interesting to me is, one, for the capacity that's already on the grid, we can be interrupted. We can demand energy 24/7 all the time. We're providing this stable base load consumer that always wants to buy energy, but at any moment, if there's an economic incentive to do so, we can turn off and make that energy available to consumers. So that's one thing. Flexible load that can be interrupted. That helps use resources more efficiently in the transmission network and make those resources available for people when they otherwise would be either paying too much for them or not available at all. And then on the generation side, there's this chicken and egg problem that we face now with energy developers who see a project, let's say, for example, a solar field that they could stand up, they could construct within 12 months, but they're waiting 5 to 7 years before they can ever sell an electron to a consumer. So this consumer isn't able to get the benefit of more energy abundance, more energy availability, and lower energy pricing because there isn't a delivery channel that has capacity. And the developer is unable to finance their project because they have no one to sell it to. So enter Bitcoin mining, this highly flexible 24/7 demand that you can run off of a cell signal or a Starlink and place anywhere. You don't need fiber, you don't need transmission lines, you just need a direct hookup to energy. And suddenly you're able to bootstrap the economic viability of what previously was a project that couldn't be funded or could only be funded by subsidies, which is something we could touch on, but that's another rabbit hole in itself. And so the beautiful thing about this is that we're making use of an energy resource before it ever comes onto the grid. And then by monetizing that resource while transmission is built out, you actually bootstrap its connection into the grid to provide more energy abundance to consumers downstream. And then you can be interrupted so that at any time that there's not stable demand on the grid, you still have a direct off-taker right there who wants your energy, but who can be interrupted in order for you to sell that energy to the grid when it's the highest and best uses for the end consumer. So it's this really amazing lattice work or web of the ability to monetize these resources all around the world, essentially bootstrap them into their connection and give them this bridge to walk over so that they can deliver abundant energy to consumers. And I've just never seen something so poorly understood and so simple that solves so many problems in such a complex system. It's really kind of unbelievable to me how this system of incentives is designed and has this impact on, honestly, one of the most complicated systems, basically an energy-rich Rube Goldberg machine that's in our world today. So that's, long-winded way of saying I'm really, really bullish on the ability for this technology to impact abundant energy for all of civilization.
I'm going to ask you to dive into that even deeper in a second because it's super interesting. That's one of the realizations I came to. I came to the realization that it's going to change the way we design cities, where we locate. Traditionally, cities were built around rich energy. Well, one reason was around rich energy sources, but it really started to get me to think like, gosh, this is going to change the way we build infrastructure, where we live, where we build cities. And Bucky hinted at this too. He kind of knew the old model of a city was somewhat obsolete and it would get a little bit more decentralized, or a lot more decentralized. And it's interesting to see his foresight on things that just seem like you would never question are likely going to happen. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about hash rate. You touched on it. It's something that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but hash rate has continued to increase, and that is that energy that's kind of in a holding pattern, you could sort of describe it as. I'm curious how you would describe hash rate.
So hash rate is just the total, well, a hash is a function. So it's a one-way function that you are expending energy to compute. And essentially on the Bitcoin network, the SHA-256 function, you are just guessing the number or the string of characters that balances an equation, for lack of a better word, or fits the last puzzle piece in a puzzle. Hash rate is how quickly you can make those guesses or create those functions. And in terms of the total network hash rate, so all of the hash rate around the world, the amount of that hash rate going toward the network is what essentially protects the protocol. It's the real world physical cost that makes it more and more difficult to fake that you have Bitcoin or double spend Bitcoin or do any of these actions that would be outside of the rule set of the agreed upon Bitcoin protocol. So if you think about it, it's essentially just a huge randomized digital wall of energy that's guarding a protocol to enforce a rule set that we've all agreed on. And to the degree that you have more hash rate, you have a taller and thicker wall of that energy that's guarding the protocol. And the cool thing about the protocol is that this hash rate is dynamic, right? So it adjusts dynamically based on how much hash rate there is, how much Bitcoin gets released, how difficult it is to find a new block. It's a control system, essentially, or a closed feedback loop that based on how much energy is being expended, how much computing power is being expended, it gets more or less difficult to get a single Bitcoin. And so by that design, you have a fixed supply issuance schedule of Bitcoin up to that 21 million coin cap. And it doesn't matter if I, go use all of the energy in America. The protocol will see that I'm doing that, adjust it within a couple of weeks, and then there will be a new standard of difficulty such that the same amount of Bitcoin gets released all the time. How is that?
That's perfect. I kind of want to build on that a little bit. So you see global hash rate continue to increase, right? Year over year, if you look at it big picture. And you were explaining it a little bit earlier. You can reallocate hash rate at any time to other sources that are needed. So until it has a better use for it, it's kind of held as hash rate. But as a miner, you have the ability to reallocate that if and when it's needed. And so I'm kind of curious, have you ever thought about hash rate as a proxy for global wealth in some ways? So I can't help but see you have this increasing energy resource all around the world that you can reallocate at any given time to either labor or material resources as needed. And so to me, it's a bit of a proxy for global wealth in some ways. I'm kind of curious if you've ever thought about it like that, or...
No, that's actually a really interesting way to think about it. Because if there's more hash rate, that means that those resources are best used toward securing the Bitcoin network. And, it dynamically adjusts based on energy availability, climate, energy pricing. So if a miner is able to make more money per se by turning off and providing that capacity back, then hash rate goes down. So in some sense, when hash rate is continuing to go up, it means that the availability of energy and computing power is going up as well. And, just like we talked about, you can see these things on many different levels. I see it as security is going up. I see it as a much harder fortress to attack or digital wall of energy to attack. But it's also just an expression of the abundance of energy resources and computing resources that exist that can be directed toward this network. So I totally agree with you. It can be a proxy for global wealth, especially over the long term.
Yeah, super interesting to hear your take on it because you're like in it. But to me, that this is also potentially the answer to what happens on a Bitcoin standard under an emergency? Ultimately, when you go down the rabbit hole, that's something that people come to. You'd have a couple questions left that are unanswered. Traditionally, I feel like the answer has always been, well, that's why you need liquidity at the central bank to flood liquidity. But what's interesting to me is as global hash rate gets built out, that's the long-term answer to on a Bitcoin standard. In an emergency, what happens when you can't inflate the money supply? Well, you have this increasing amount of hash rate that you can allocate if and when necessary to things like whatever it is, food production or labor resources, and it's distributed all around the world. So as those emergencies come and rise, rather than flooding the system with a bunch of money, which was one reason that the Fed has been around historically, you have all this abundant energy. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because that's one question that I haven't heard anyone answer in a way without saying, well, we'll be on a different system, so there won't be as many emergencies, which I think is also valid.
Yeah, that's valid. I mean, what I like to say is the more energy that Bitcoin uses into the future, the better, because it's this highly flexible resource that we already use the digital energy analogy, right? If you think of it, it's sort of like the world's battery, both in an energy sense and an economic sense. And if we think that energy and money are these concepts that maybe are not so dissimilar, and really they're kind of two sides of the same coin, where money is just an expression of energy, the more hash rate, the more computing power devoted to the network, the more of the world's total energy going to the Bitcoin network, essentially the bigger our battery that we have available to deploy into something else. So whether it's an emergency scenario or in fact just a higher return scenario, let's say we've got to use those energy resources for something greater, like we're expanding to another planet or whatever it may be, or building an energy storage device or energy harnessing device to go and create, that takes a lot of energy up front to develop. We've already created a system that's monetizing vast energy resources and can be interrupted at any time to reallocate those energy resources to something else, whether you're talking about the literal energy that's being put into the network or the economic energy that you're getting out of those energy resources can be repurposed into something else. So I see it, if you like, as this sort of puzzle piece that can be put in or taken out at will to be repurposed for whatever is the highest and best use at the time. And I think that's one of the key misunderstandings is, maybe Bitcoin mining isn't the highest and best use of energy at every single time, but as a way to utilize unused resources and make economic use of them and generate more productivity, more innovation, more progress. It's this amazing bootstrap that gets us into the place where we can utilize it in a better way and still save those resources and not just essentially, let that energy go from a high potential state to a low potential state without letting anything happen. Think of a hydropower dam, for example. You've got this water from glacial melt and rain and whatnot that gets stored in a hydropower dam. At a certain point, you have to let water run through the turbines or run around the turbine system, because otherwise the dam will break. So there's this need to actually utilize energy in the system in order for it to not be overloaded. And every time that you just let water flow over the dam without actually using it, you've introduced a little bit of waste into the system. It's unfortunate. If you've got the turbine there, if you've got a use case there, then is it really a waste if you put it into this energy battery rather than just letting it run around? And so we're always finding these ways, whether it's double spending hydropower energy to mine instead of letting it run through a dam, or double spending heat where you're already running the energy through a resistive heater in someone's house. There's no reason why that resistive heater couldn't be made of silicon and doing something interesting in those circuits to double spend that energy. So I just think it's this optimization of how we allocate resources that we're continually refining and working toward, and will only become more interesting as time goes on and more impactful. So while we're less than 1% of the world's energy right now toward the Bitcoin mining network, it might be a really interesting future that we get to live in if we're at like 20 or 30%.
Yeah, you just put it perfectly, much more eloquently than I could have, but I think that's a really interesting point. Bucky would talk about exactly what you said. He called it shunting energy or valving energy. And it took me a really long time to wrap my head around what he was trying to talk about here, but you just prompted it. So I'm going to pull up a diagram. I haven't actually done this before, so I don't know that it's going to work, but I'm just a visual person. So I kind of want
Yeah,
to
let's see it.
talk through this with you. Concept of block time. And Bucky would talk about calendar time versus clock time. And he understood that time is relative. And I might lose you here, so we can tap out of this at any point. In like 1905, Einstein, I think, proved to a certain extent time is relative depending on the speed you're moving at. And so if time is relative, in order to get a constant time, you need a different variable. And he talked about this for those that are listening, I suppose. This is just time in the x-axis, 10-minute intervals, which is the Bitcoin block time. And then he talked about because the speed of light is a constant, or energy moves at the speed of light is the constant. He called this shunting energy. And this behaves really close to the difficulty adjustment. And so he was saying, in order to keep a constant interval in time, you need to shunt energy, which here is shown as one shunt is the equivalent of one hash. And so as more and more energy comes into each block, 10-minute block of time, the amount of shunts or hashes has to increase. And so this is kind of exactly what we're seeing the Bitcoin network behave like. And here it kind of goes up and down. But as you know, over the long course of time, it's just sort of constantly going up. And so people talk about Satoshi's contribution to Bitcoin. It's sort of this collective effort over time. The difficulty adjustment is something that's unique, but this was a diagram that Bucky had put together that I feel like really describes what's happening with the Bitcoin network.
I don't know that I've got anything really profound to add to that, other than I do believe that time is essentially a construct, that it's not necessarily fundamental to the nature of how the universe organizes itself. And that in some ways, Bitcoin inventing its own way of keeping time is a reflection of that there may be a more honest way of accounting for time than hands on a clock, and really basing it on more of an internal measure. And there's no like beautiful physical insight to get from this, but I think back to one of my business coaches who says we don't actually manage time in our lives. We actually manage energy. And you shouldn't be thinking about just how you're allocating time, but how you're setting up your life to utilize your energy best. And that even if you have a perfectly laid out and organized timekeeping schedule that's fully allocated, efficient resource use, you may be doing your energy a disservice. And there's times where you wake up, you've got all the energy in the world to create, and 1 hour in the morning is not the same as an hour in the evening. They don't have the same value. They don't have the same characteristics. You've got different brain chemistry at those points in the day. You probably should be doing different work. And so as closely as our biological system, our human energy system mirrors that idea that every time unit is not equal, it has more to do with what kind of potential energy lies in that time block. Again, nothing really to glean from this other than I think the most well-designed systems have a kind of mirror to each other and can be looked at these different levels, and you can see these similarities.
At a certain point, I can't wrap my head around it either, but I do find it fascinating. And I think through conversation, I often come to realizations. So I enjoy just bouncing some of these ideas off of people. There is one last question, kind of a deep question, similar to the time chain. The Bitcoin power law has been somewhat controversial. I've seen that you've talked to some people about it. Take price out of it for a reason, because it seems to trigger some people. I can't help but, see that there's definitely something deep going on here that we don't quite understand yet, personally. But for the sake of the argument, take price out of it, right? There's still a power law in the Bitcoin hash rate compared to time or addresses. That's super interesting to me. I can't help but think it was intentional, but I'm curious, have you given this much thought at all? Or do you have any thoughts on Bitcoin hash rate following a power law?
Yeah, so I've had Giovanni on the podcast and we talked about power law. And for the people that don't have any background in this, it's essentially a mathematical correlation that applies to the size of organisms, like the terminal size of organisms based on their weight, the size of communities, the growth rate of communities, terminal size of communities, and all of these different physical and biological systems that seems to follow a predictable, not exactly an exponential curve, but a power law curve. I don't have a hardline stance on it, but I do believe that there is merit to viewing Bitcoin in some sense as a living biological system or community. It's based on individuals. It has these kind of internal growth factors that are based largely on the people that are involved in it, the resources that are allocated to it, the time that has elapsed since it was created, right? So its age. I see the correlation. It's you can't deny the fit to a curve. The hash rate, even the price chart, the number of wallet addresses, there's a really strong correlation with the power law with this. And I don't think that that's so off base, because if you think about Bitcoin, and I've talked with Brandon Quittem a bit about this, and he's done a deeper explanation than I ever could. Bitcoin does behave like a living system itself. It's a network that resists entropy, that has this kind of baked in system that's channeling energy to expand and resist the natural adversarial forces of being a living being in the universe, and in some sense is not that dissimilar to a life form. And most living things, or I guess you could say all living things, all living systems, have this adherence to their own power law. So I won't say I'm a hardline power law believer, especially when it comes to price. I don't, especially in the short term, price can dislocate very quickly. But over that long run of the power law graph, so far we've held to it. And I don't see any harm in acknowledging that there's a fit to that curve and that it has worked so far. Will it hold forever? I don't know. But so far, it's not a dumb thing to try to find mathematical relationships to systems like this.
Yeah, sure. It's clearly something we don't quite understand yet. Obviously, you've talked to a few astrophysicists about this too, and everyone's trying to figure out what's going on here. Let me just tie it to Bucky's work real quick as we wrap out here, because I'm just curious about this, and I'm interested in other people's takes. But this is the most interesting power law to me. It's the hash rate and addresses and time. So again, take the price out of it. Maybe that, for the sake of the argument, this seems interesting to me, because this is the behavior that physicists have picked up in the behavior of the network. And it's basically saying for every new address, the hash rate increases at a power of 4. And so if we go back to our earlier conversation about hash rate being this proxy for global wealth, for every person who enters the network, the global wealth increases at a proportion greater than 1-to-1. And it's super interesting to me because it kind of starts to get at this accretive dilution that Saylor's also doing. But to me, I see this and I see, here's a system that was engineered where someone joins the network and you're depreciating the coinage, but you're increasing your percentage of the overall hash rate. And Bucky would talk about relationships like this that our minds were able to find. And the reason I'm going to tie it to Bucky's work is the geodesic dome. I don't know. Are you familiar with the geodesic dome?
I've heard of it. I couldn't explain it to you.
So that's a structure that Bucky is most potentially famous for. A lot of people thought he was an architect, but he was very clear in his writing that his architecture was just a way of explaining his philosophy. And the geodesic dome also behaves like a power law, where the bigger it gets, the more nodes there are, the more efficient the system becomes. And so I can't help but see that he's starting to pick up on some underlying physical properties that he said our minds are capable of discovering, and time locking that into his architecture. And this might be a stretch, but I look at the way the network's behaving and I can't unsee it. So I'm curious what other people think. Obviously, this could be proven wrong, but you're someone who's spent a lot of time in this space. And so I wanted to talk that through with you as we run out of time here.
Yeah, honestly, this is a wonderful place to end, because I think it ties into everything that we've already talked about. I'm forgetting what the law is called, but in social networks, when you're valuing a social network, it's not the number of users, it's the square of the number of users, because every marginal user that you put onto a new network creates an entirely new distribution of nodes and connections between those nodes. And it's the hallmark of the win-win-win, the 1 + 1 = 3. You said accretive dilution. These instances where adding a marginal unit to a system doesn't just perform addition in terms of its value, it actually has this exponential addition in value. And that's part of why I am so excited to be in the Bitcoin space, in the Bitcoin mining space, is I believe that with each new unit of time, energy, adoption, people that get involved with this, it's not a one-to-one correlation of the value that it creates for the world. It really is following this exponential path of creating outsized benefit. And I just have to laugh at the people who call it a Ponzi scheme, because in a Ponzi scheme, the person who comes in last is enriching the person who was there first at that last person's expense. And in a system like this, where each new user increases the value in an exponential fashion, everybody is enriched, including that recent comer, by their new participation. And a great example of this, the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve that we heard about yesterday, that was signed by an executive order. That is a benefit to the US, that is a benefit to current holders, that is a benefit to other people who will come in the future, that particular node has come onto the network. And people argue with me on this, especially the libertarians, of which I'm highly aligned, so don't get too mad at me. And it's this wonderful thing to work toward, and this wonderful thing to be a part of, when every unit of your effort can be multiplied in such a fashion that it provides way outsized value than what you could contribute alone in an isolated system. And that is the second and third order effect that I am really excited to see play out over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, and the remainder of a lifetime. Is most of these unbelievable changes that happen are toward the tail end of a curve. So compound interest, famously, the first 29 years out of a 30-year cycle, you've got a portion of the gains, and vast majority comes toward that end of the tail. And that's just how it seems to work with networks like this. Is the early years, you start to see momentum building, and then really once it hits stride, the value just explodes for everybody on it. And I don't know how close we are, how far we are, or how we can even tell when that value quotient has exploded for every user of this network, every user of this technology. But the longer that I'm in it, the more obvious it becomes that this is changing the world.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. In some ways, it's so simple, isn't it? It's suggesting that if we collaborate, we live in a positive sum world. So I'll use that to kind of wrap this up. I really appreciate you carving out some time. I think that's a great note to end this on. In summary, this is the first time we've ever really encountered something like this. We're all trying to figure it out. And in many ways, I don't think we have the words to describe what's going on. And so I really appreciate exploring some of these ideas with you, because I think Bucky's work suggests that the work you're doing at Abundant Minds is not really an accidental side effect of the system, but in many ways, it's the whole point. And I think the work you guys are doing is so important and so interesting. So I encourage you to keep it up and keep sharing all your learnings with people. With that, I'll let you go. You probably don't have any closing statements because that one was perfect, but where can people find more about you and learn more about what you do at Abundant Minds?
I really appreciate you having me on, Mac. This was absolutely a blast. And something you said earlier, conversations like this are in a lot of ways how we learn, how we reflect to each other. So I've gotten a lot out of this, and every conversation like this helps me expand my horizons and look a little bit further. So I really appreciate you, and the quality of your questions super high. So really appreciate you putting some thought into it. People that want to find me, I am on X. My handle is Beau_Turner21. You can find my company Abundant Minds at abundantminds.com, at Abundant Minds on pretty much every social media platform, Instagram, X, Facebook, YouTube. We could do a lot of long form content, and would love to help anybody through the co-location space. And in general, just happy to keep educating about Bitcoin and these really far out downstream effects. So appreciate you having me on, Mac. This was super fun for me.
Yeah, likewise. A wealth of knowledge. So thank you.